Welcome to Straight Talk on PLZ Soccer's YouTube channel. I'm Peter Martin, and I'm delighted to say my special guest is an old compatriot of mine, an old teammate from STV days, Bernard Ponsonby. Bernard, I never thought maybe 30 years ago I was going to say, listen, we'll be doing some podcast that'll be in my studios, and I get a chance to grill you.
Waldorf and Statler speak, eh?
Exactly. When I first knew you, your hair wasn't silver, I have to tell you.
Well, yeah, when I knew you, you were no need for the Jags, need for the... No, but mind you, in those days, I mean, journalism was very boozy. We were all on the gin fast plan.
Yeah, it's funny, I'm glad you said that, because the funny thing was when I met you, but when I was in that building, the first week I joined STV, the very first time around, talking the early 90s, I actually remember going in the first week and thinking, am I good enough to be here? You get that sense of insecurity once you move from radio to television.
Why could you not hold your drink?
Well, and this brings me nicely to the next point, because in the Monday, I didn't see anybody in the sports department. And I thought, where is everybody? And they were all in Trader Joe's till the Thursday, and the programme was on the Friday. And I'm thinking to myself, what the hell's going on here?
There's too much drinking.
There was heavy boozers,
And there's too much hooring.
Yes. Although to be fair,
did you get your share of that as well?
No, I was wet behind the ears. I'm thinking to myself, this place is mental. But the one thing that you'll be well aware of is the people who were there were actually good operators. So they chased the story. I mean, Jim White chased the story. He was a real, what I would call a proper news chaser. McNee was there at the time as well. And they were they could play hard, but they worked hard when it came to the bit where you had to deliver something. But that wasn't my style. I was brought up, drink, the whole journalism team that could go at it. That wasn't me.
That was just the culture of the time, and indeed, it was the days when expenses were generous. Because when I started at STV, I was called in, I think, after the second lot of expenses that I'd put in. And you remember the news editor, John Keane?
Yes.
Hello, son, come into my office. It's about your expenses. And I thought, God, here we go. I've made a mess of this. He said, you'll have to spend a bit more. That if people think you can survive in this, they'll think we can all survive in this. And there was like back in those days, it was like an organised fraud of the finance department.
Yes.
Because you were just told to do it. And I remember one year, this would have been for some fancy accounting reasons in the annual reports. There's no pay increase, but you can have an extra £75 a week on the eckies. So that was like an extra £300 a month. Again, probably because the expenses were tax deductible, at some stage. But you're right. I mean, the sports department. The best story I have about drinking at STV, you may well remember that there was a restaurant in Whiteinch called The Cabin, very, very nice restaurant in Glasgow, and everybody decided that they were going to hold their Christmas party at The Cabin. So I had phoned on behalf of the politics team, which was Scottish Questions, was the political programme in those days, and Scott Sport had been in, Scottish Action had been in, and so I had phoned to be told, we're taking no more bookings from STV. We've already had your sports people in and your social action people in. So, and that was just the personalities were big. I mean, Jim White, when he started, actually didn't start at STV doing sport at all. Jim used to do a series of and finalies. He always did the and finally on Scotland Today, and then he sort of transitioned to doing sport. And Arthur Montford retired after 32 years in '89, took over that. Jerry McNee was, I suppose, your sort of foot in the door type of journalist. Back in the '70s, that kind of job was done by Alec Cameron. But everybody in the building all over, irrespective of the genre of programme that you worked on, had a big personality.
Yeah.
And a big thirst.
Well, absolutely. I mean, and that was the one thing that I was a toucan Dan for anything like that. I always had that feeling in my head, I've got to graft, I've got to try and survive around this crew. But it was always about trying to break stories, because the one thing that Jerry McNee said to me in the first week, which left me completely gobsmacked, was, by the way, you're here, and this is his first line to me, and this is how I started my bottle crash, because he said, by the way, if you haven't got a story, you're not getting on. Don't think you're here and you're employed under our umbrella, and you'll automatically be on the television or Scott Sport or Extra Time. No story, not getting on. Do you understand me? And he walked away, and I thought, well, I operated that way anyway in radio, because I had to chase stories every day. Yeah, so it didn't. But I just thought, wow, this is a right unfriendly place.
I thought it was also. It was a place where you'd lots of laughs. I mean, people may remember, or they may not, that Fergus McCann bought Jim White's flat in Pollokshields. So Fergus buys Jim White's flat in Kirkcaldy Road in Pollokshields. And but a week later, Jim White's at a press conference at Celtic Park, and the Bunnet's there. And so they finish the press conference, and McCann says, "Oh, Mr. White, I need a word with you." And so Jim stays behind, and McCann says, "You sold me a Duff fridge." So McCann had complained, but the fridge wasn't working in the flat. There's also a story, I don't know if this is true, and I can't remember who told me, that Jerry McNee was trying to get McCann out to lunch, and obviously to establish a relationship and so on. And had eventually, I think it was Peter McLean, wasn't it? That was the PR guy for Fergus. And they managed to get Fergus out to the Regano, and the voice of football is perusing the menu, and the lobster thermidor is very good, and I gather this is very good. And just order what you want, Fergus. And McCann sees, just with the salt and pepper cruets a little card. And he takes the card, and the card says, 2 courses, £14, and says, "What's wrong with this menu?" And those kind of stories say a lot about McCann.
Yeah.
And I remember sitting in the North Stand, because my father and I had 2 seats in the North Stand, 2 of the best seats in the house. And I remember one season, McCann's got the microphone, and he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back to Celtic Park. I'd like to introduce you to our 2 new employees." And he introduces DeCanio at this point, and I thought the use of the word employees tells you everything you need to know. This man was not going to be knocked about by the ego of players or the ego of agents. And I remember saying, "He'll do for me."
Yeah, well, the funny thing about him was he was very, very shrewd with his money, and tight as a drum. And Tam Burns and I, who were pals, and Tam said to me, he says, the funniest thing was I had to fight to get Andreas Tom. He says, and he didn't want him signed because he was a German who wanted all the T's crossed and the I's dotted on the contract. He wanted every penny. And afterwards,
Thin Dime, I think, was
that's it.
Thin Dime.
One Thin Dime. So eventually, he says to Tam, "This guy's out of control, man." And he goes like that. He says, "Well, if you're not going to sign him," and Tam pulls the curtains back, says, "You better tell the 3,000 or 4,000 out there that he's not signing." And after he'd come out, he just walked into Tam and he went, "He took me for every dime. That contract, I'm paying for his kids' private school as well, So that kind of summed him up. He was that type of man. But he did exactly what he said on the tin.
He did exactly what you would say in the tin. And there were 2 stories that McCann told on camera. And if you remember, at the time of the share issue, Celtic had lost the League Cup final at Ibrox against Raith Rovers.
Yeah.
And he was in his office at Celtic Park looking down Kerrydale Street, and the prospectus for the share issue was being collected by supporters. He said, "We just lost a cup final. It was absolutely bucketing down from the heavens, And these people were queuing all the way down to London Road in the rain after a cup final had been lost to have their steak. And he said, I just looked at that, and it was at that, he said, at that point, I thought, I cannot let these people down.
Yeah.
And the other story that he tells were, and I mean, Fergus wasn't one for emotion because he had that very stoical exterior, but he told the story of being in a supermarket and there's a guy with a baby, and the guy stops him and holds the baby in front of him. You know, it's almost like Kunta Kinte and Roots.
I remember that.
It's almost like Kunta Kinte and Roots, and he said, Fergus, Celtic's youngest supporter. And he said, he just kept in the back of his mind, I cannot let these people down. And there was nothing at all which was sophisticated or complicated. He was just direct. He just said what he was going to do. He did it. He wouldn't be kicked around. But you also had a sort of idea of what was going on in those days.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'll get to that shortly, by the way. The funny thing is, I don't know if it's a preconception in your head sometimes because of the nature of the political journalists that I have known, including yourself, down through the years. I'm saying to myself, you know, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to have a chat with Bernard, we're going to talk a wee bit of football, but definitely going to talk politics, because obviously I love politics, whether it's here or whether it's in the USA as well. Absolutely obsessed with it since I was a youngster. And I thought to myself, you know, how do I just kind of play Bernard's tactics here, which is a nice wee cuddle and then a left hook, because that's what Martin O'Neill used to say to me. He said, you know, he said, you are the most cantankerous journalist I've ever met. And I thought to myself, thanks for that, Martin.
Well, but political interviews are never about the question. They're always about the supplementary. And the problem about the question is that politicians have always, they know what you're going to be asked.
Yeah.
What you have to do in order to, in our trade, what we call get a line, get a story, get something that's new, give it a fresh angle, give it a fresh pair of legs, is actually to listen to what they're saying.
Yeah.
And then
First thing I tell my journalists.
and be prepared to take the interview in a certain direction. When I used to do sort of half-hour sit-downs with all the party leaders, we would sit down and say, well, we want to say something about the economy, we want to say something about the constitutional question, we want to say something about the health service. But if at any point in the interview something is said which is a story, you have to be prepared to just throw away your pre-rehearsed script,
Yes.
and take it in a direction because you think this is interesting. And one of the problems actually with interviews now is that the questions are very, very predictable. The answers are very, very predictable. Politicians know how long they've got in an interview, so they filibuster.
Yeah.
And you know, if you're a student of political interviews going back to the 1960s and the 70s, it was watch them all. And I mean, YouTube is a marvelous actually facility. Thames Television have uploaded just about all of their political archive, and you can watch Mrs. Thatcher being interviewed, you can watch Jim Callaghan, Harold Wilson. They answer questions.
Yes.
And they treat the audience as growing up, and they respect the medium that is conveying their messages to the people. It's all different now.
It is, but I think that's probably why, you know, I know it must be, it's not frustrating for you because you're in the game and you know exactly how the game works, especially when you were at your peak. With Martin, he was brilliant at taking...
I can still speak, Peter, at the peak. You
Yes,
know, the knees haven't gone.
No. You are Rafa Nadal. You're coming out for every complimentary tournament now. But Martin used to take you off in a mazy.
Yeah.
Because he didn't want to answer the question.
Yeah.
So I used to butt in, which annoyed the life out of him, you know. And you do that with managers who don't want to answer the question. But I agree with you. I think you have to listen as well.
But I mean, the interesting thing from your point of view, because, I mean, interviews are interviews and the techniques are the techniques. But it'd be interesting to get your perspective on this, because people who run the country, actually, big politicians with real responsibility, the more senior the politician is, the harder the time that they expect. And if they're not grilled by somebody who's done their homework and knows their stuff, they almost feel that you're not doing your job. It's always struck me that when it comes to people in football, that the egos are so precious that if I could use a loose term, set about them in the way in which you would set about a politician. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean it in a way to try and interrogate them to find out what is going on. Then it ends up in people being banned.
Listen, I'm there. I've been there. I am there. The problem is that I bring journalists on, try and educate them in broadcasting, send them out to other companies, fine, they come here and they move on. I always say to them, and I know we know there's a percentage of people in Scotland who, no matter what I'm about to say, they'll say, you were at that school, you're that religion, you're this fan, doesn't matter to them. So, but what I will say is, and it was something that was said to me when I was a young journalist, if you pander to Celtic and Rangers, your credibility's gone. You are a journalist, you've got to be there. Yeah, now I know you obviously are brought up a Celtic fan, so was I. But my whole ethos from day one was I can't pander to people. I can have friendships. I can watch Celtic because of the way I was brought up with my mother, who took me all over the country to see Celtic. But when I get into journalism, no chance. My job was to break stories. My job was to get stories. My job was to interview people. And by the way, I tried not to be, somebody who was. I didn't want to be jock.
No.
I would pay the respect to them, but I wanted to ask the question. And I say to journalists who work for me now, you pander to them, you're goosed.
I do think that in a sense, people hold back. The one thing that I think people don't like is being cut out or not on the inside. When I was hired for STV by a guy called David Scott. Now, David Scott, in the 60s, 70s and 80s, across both newspapers and broadcasting, was probably one of the great giants of Scottish journalism. And David was a Hearts man, sadly passed away a couple of years ago. But David's view of journalism was that it was about making a bit of gentle mischief, and the purpose was to ask a question that somebody does not want to answer because they want to either sort of cover something up or misrepresent. And I remember he said, the ideal situation would be that all of his journalists were banned by the government, banned by all of the opposition parties, banned by Celtic, banned by Rangers. Because he took the view that if you're doing your job to interrogate and to get behind headlines, then people are going to be displeased. And he was entirely comfortable with being displeased. I mean, you may well remember, it's an absurd thing when you think about it now. Dermot McCorry, I think, was the director. And Dermot was the director who found Graham Souness on the touchline when Graham Souness had a touchline ban. So this was just sort of pointed out, matter of fact, that Mr. Souness had breached his ban. And all of a sudden, STV find themselves banned. I mean, it's the sort of hysterical overreaction to all of this kind of stuff. And by the way, I now think it's much worse now than it was back then, because that was obviously something which took place back in the 1980s. I always sort of say when you find this sort of bad-tempered exchanges on social media, which has become a platform which advertises people frequently who are no right in the heed, could we just all chill for a moment? Could we just all take the temperature down and what is it that we're actually talking about and try and do it rationally? And I think one of the problems about stuff where it's political blogs or sports blogs, it's the way in which people feel, first of all, I can only contribute if I'm absolutely angry or being at the moon at 4 a.m, having had a little refreshment, and taking positions which are just overly tribal and put forward in tones of hysteria. If you actually just say, we calm it all down and just talk about this rationally.
Yeah, but social media reminds me of an old 1970s movie, right out of the back field here, but it was an old movie called Convoy, which starred Chris Christopherson, and he drives across America in one of the classic American trucks, and then all of a sudden he finds he's got about 6,000 trucks behind him, and they're thinking, what's this about? By the time you get to the fourth truck, they're saying it's all about the farmers. And by the time you get to the 12th truck, it's all about some other thing, because what happens is you put a tweet out, and by the time you get to the fourth person, he's battering the guy who's in the fifth tweet. So you lose the whole message, which you rightly say. And it goes back to what you were talking about politics. And I was really interested when you're talking about people who try and take you off away from, because they don't want to answer the question. One of the people that I admired and one of my favourite politicians of all time, and I'm sure people will pick holes in it for me, but when I was a kid, I listened to Tony Benn. Mm-hmm. I loved him. I bought my mate and his dad tickets. Let's go to Edinburgh Playhouse. Tony Benn speaking, right? So we go to the Edinburgh Playhouse. Tony Benn walks onto stage with nothing, no backdrop, nothing. A table, a pot of tea, a chair, and a microphone. And he sits down and the place is mobbed. And Tony Benn said, I'll do an opening monologue, he said, then I'll take questions on any topic, any global affair, anything. I'll answer it for you. And I thought to myself, you're kidding. I just watched the drama unfold, and he could analyse American politics, dissect it, tell you why they took this stance on a country, tell you that they destabilised this country, tell you why they saddled into this country because of the arms that they were selling them. And suddenly you got this insight into British politics, you get the insight into the global affairs. He was magnificent. Yeah. But you don't get that type of person.
Partly because politicians now don't have what Dennis Healey used to refer to as a hinterland. I mean, Ben, of course, succeeded to his father's peerage,
yes.
Renounced the peerage, fought a by-election in Bristol in the early 1960s. But he was around in Labour politics, certainly in the 1950s. He was one of the few, he was a brilliant communicator and a fantastic orator.
Yeah.
And the thing about orators, of course, who are spellbinding, and when he was in full oratorical flow, he could be spellbinding. What happens with orators is that they drag you along in the emotion of the argument, not necessarily the argument itself, but they drag you along in the emotion of the argument.
What hacks you off now then, from all your years of working at the coalface, and then suddenly you get to the tail end and you see the way politics now is being operated? I mean, what's your view from the transformation? You've quoted, late 60s there, mid 60s. Then you've gone through the Wilson, the Heath years. Then, of course, in this area where you're actually situated in this studio, you could not put a statue up here of Margaret Thatcher because it would be burned within about 1.2 seconds. And then you suddenly live through the hope years of Tony Blair and this yellow brick road to where we are now. What goes through your mind?
I think the sad thing is that politics is now just an extension of the entertainment genre. I mean, you look at these, politicians who go into, I don't watch reality TV, so I'll be misquoting the programs. Big Brother, or that jungle thing that ITV did, or even that Strictly, I've never seen any of these programs.
Yeah, I don't watch them either.
Strictly Come Dancing. But you get politicians who now go on to this, and they say it's to connect with a wider audience. It's not. They go on for the money because the fees are fantastically high. But there is simply no way, whether they were of the left or the right, that a politician would be seen doing any of that kind of stuff back then. I was watching... There's two when I was on the BBC on Brexit, and Johnson's contribution to this is an utter disgrace. I mean, what an utter disgrace of an individual. And you just watch that, and what you get from this is that it was always a game. It was, as Osborne, his cabinet colleague, said, for Johnson it was always a Game of Thrones, and it was always about inheriting the crown. And the very last line, after he's flip-flopped on whether or not he supports Brexit, and he said, well, we got it over the line, but, well, we didn't have a plan. So, there.
Yeah.
And you think, these are decisions which are taken, which say stuff about a country, which have profound economic consequences and also consequences for your relationship with other European countries. And for this man, it's a game, when it used to be, at one point, almost the sort of the noblest vocation of them all, which was to serve your fellow citizens in order to do good. When I was a boy growing up, not a million miles from here in Cambuslang, your MP was respected.
Yeah.
Now people just regard politicians as a waste of space.
Yeah. The other aspect of it, which I think really annoys me, and, you know, we couldn't even take the moral high ground with what's going on with politics in America and Trump, because obviously, you know, I say we, but England voted in a buffoon, which was Johnson, and he sold a lie, and his whole cabinet, for me, were not accountable. You look at what's happened in his reign, and then on to Liz Truss and the debacle with the economy and what she did. Nobody's accountable. The people who, during COVID, who were fast-tracked into areas where they were able to take large amounts of money from the British economy, nobody's accountable. You know, you fall behind here in this area in your tax, you'd think you committed a murder.
Yes,
you know what I mean?
Yes,
but nobody's accountable at that level. And I just thought, you know, one misdemeanour from Johnson's term would have brought about the downfall of Harold Wilson, you know, in the 70s, but not now. You know, you can go through daily, you know, Donald Trump's speeches, and you think, this guy, misogynistic, sexist, you know, racist, everything is thrown into it. And now we here can't take the moral high ground, never mind prime ministers. We've got a guy who has basically divided the country on a web of lies, going to the European community and talking about immigrants as if these are not human beings, and he's now sold a lie, and he's now been given a platform on the BBC, which I'm very critical of, and I'm talking about Nigel Farage. This guy didn't even have a party, and he was on Question Time 5, 10, 15 times to allow him the chance to spread his bile. And now you've got people who are actually embracing his divisive message.
One of the problems that we have, and this... you know, no doubt, I can almost hear people saying, oh, he's just elitist and all of this kind of stuff, is that back in the day when there was respect for politicians and when journalists were doing their job trying to provide a public service by road testing whether or not what the parties were telling you was truthful or not. And the public service was to say, well, this is what they're saying, you, the voters, make up your mind. The problem is, and this is a wider issue of the interface between journalism and a poor public discourse, resulting in politicians who are completely and utterly ill-equipped to do with the challenges which the country and indeed the world faces. So we have a situation now where politicians almost live in a post-truth society. You know, when people talk about alternative facts, there's a word for alternative facts, it's called lies. And in a social media age where, before we were recording this, you were making the point, people have very, very little attention span. People form views now on the basis of mood and emotion and what they think. The fact that somebody like Trump or Boris Johnson in the UK, what people are electing here are showmen. They are not electing serious people for serious times. They are electing showmen where the purpose of elected office for these people and winning elected office is an extension of their egotistical personality. And that's where public discourse has actually led us to, because the discourse itself is no longer informed, because facts no longer matter.
But are we guilty of allowing the lack of a safety net, the lack of a structure, the lack of allowing misinformation to get out there? Because social media has, as you mentioned there, for me it's a platform at times for people who, as you say, are not right in the head, but you've got a platform for people that you would not listen to on their opinion, and you also have a situation where we don't seem to have the checks and balances to say, no, this is misinformation, this is lies, and if you keep doing it, I mean, even Keir Starmer's coming out and talking about, you know, taking some of the tech companies to task over images that children can see. That's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, you're allowed to actually form a strategy where you can peddle your lies to get someone elected. I think it's a scary situation. I wonder where the blame lies, and I wonder when eventually the penny drops where we can tighten.
And one of the issues, of course, is the demise of the traditional media, the mainstream media, the old media. Call it what you want. Now, it's not a sort of perfect situation. It really isn't a perfect situation. The BBC will go through cuts after cuts after cuts. If you withdraw the extent of your global footprint, world service under attack and so on, that has consequences. And I think back, and you will remember, because if you look at all the big current affairs shows that were on, obviously Panorama was always the flagship policy on the BBC, which was about winkling out misdemeanours and all the rest of it. On ITV, you had World in Action, which was a groundbreaking. This Week was the other. World in Action was made by Granada. This Week was made by Thames Television. On a Sunday at lunchtime, you had Weekend World. The first presenter was Peter Jay, who was married to Jim Callaghan's daughter. Jay gave it up in order to become the ambassador to the United States, succeeded by Brian Walden, who was a Labour MP. And this was long format. The researchers, by the way, on Weekend World, John Birt, who went on to become Director General of the BBC. Peter Mandelson was also a researcher on Weekend World. But there was a sense in which you can take serious issues and have a serious 1-hour interview, and if people want it, they'll watch it. If they don't want it, they don't need to watch it. But it is within our remit, it is our mission to explain. All you get is when you get a public who have no appetite for serious stuff, you will notice. People who make decisions on programmes, they try to, in a sense, mirror where things are going. And if people collectively hold hands and want to dumb it down, you can bet your bottom dollar the broadcasters will follow. And that's before you get to the newspapers.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, I don't see it. I don't see those checks and balances, or indeed an increase in the quality happening. I think we're going down a slippery slope. I mean, I know the BBC. I know you've been critical of STV, our former employee, I would say you gave an honest assessment of where things are going at STV and other broadcasters. The BBC is facing that similar situation where I think it's going to really struggle in the next few years to try and justify anyone paying the licence. And subsequently since then, the argument of, and they're going through this propaganda spin at the moment, it's your BBC, it's our BBC, the integrity. You know, I love the whole thing that they come up with is BBC verified. Why the hell do we need BBC verified? Just tell us the truth in the first place. I don't need a tag on it. You're supposed to be this flagship of integrity. I don't need BBC verified. I'm just saying I've turned you on and I expect you to deliver the quality. But I think now they are going to struggle to actually find their way in the society as the the flagship of integrity that they used to peddle to you over the 70s and 80s, because the funding's not there, Bernard.
Yeah.
And I wonder where you think
Well,
they're going.
the problem is that the license fee is an anomaly. The license fee is a tax on watching television, and it's a tax on watching television in a digital age. I mean, there is, in that sense, very little justification for it. So they have to, in a sense, redesign where it is they want to go. I mean, everybody at some stage will have been very critical of the BBC. I mean, politicians of different political parties over the years have been critical of the BBC. During the independence referendum, Alex Salmond was very critical of the BBC. What he saw is a pro-union bias. Margaret Thatcher...
Do you share that view with him?
Well, I take the view that Blair Jenkins took, and of course Blair Jenkins was the chief executive of Yes Scotland. Blair Jenkins was a head of news and current affairs at the BBC. He was a head of news and current affairs at STV, and I worked with Blair when he was at STV. You can find certainly stories which were completely and utterly unacceptable, and as standalone, having to justify, you couldn't justify, and were biased. And Alec, because it was in the pugilistic nature of Alex Salmond's personality, zoned in on a report by Nick Robinson, which was indefensible. The issue there is that symptomatic of absolutely everything in terms of the output that the BBC does? And people like and Derek Bateman, who was a journalist at the BBC, who was very pro-independence, took the view, no, it's not. But these things shouldn't happen. I saw things, incidentally, during the independence referendum, which took place on ITN, where my jaw was literally on the floor.
Yeah.
But if you say something which is loose with language, or something which is pejorative, and it's pejorative to the extent which it is biased, then you are less likely to get complaints if you're working for ITN than you are at the BBC, because the BBC footprint is so large as the biggest media organisation in the country that there will be kickback. I saw a very senior ITV journalist who was parachuted up here for the last 4 or 5 days of the independence referendum campaign, when it was very emotive and very emotional and very divisive and close. And he said, well, I used to work as the Ireland correspondent, and so I know all about tribalism. It feels a bit like that. And I thought, wait a minute, this is an exercise in democratic politics where everybody, perhaps for the only time in our history, is properly engaged as a citizen. And here's somebody that comes up from ITN to make a comparison with politics in Northern Ireland. I thought, nobody's killing one another here. Yeah. It's the exact opposite, actually. Yeah. And that kind of loose language, or to make an analogy, to make a point, is why people get scunnered. But just in one sort of final defence of people who do what you and I do, particularly now where a lot of broadcasting is live, particularly when you don't get the chance to sit down and think about it, being accurate with your reporting, being accurate with your language, doing it live for hours on end, and it's easy to get one word out of place and for your reputation to be compromised as a result. It's no easy.
No, it's not easy. And with that in mind, I think there's a lot of things in the BBC that they do really well. And I think that is what they're holding on to. I think the rest of it, I think there's been a lot of spending which could ease, when you look at us, I mean, I've been in Radio Clyde, God almighty, I'm in the commercial, there's me and a pundit, and there's 6 of them. Yes, do you know what I mean?
Peter, I went in, I was hired by, having anchored election programmes for, 30 years for STV. I was hired by the BBC to go in and do the most recent Scottish election programme, and I went in to find a dressing room with my name on it. And I'd never had that in 34 years in the commercial sector.
Well, not only that, I watched you that night and I thought to myself, I wonder what he feels about, 2 or 3 floor managers, makeup artists, a lot. Fantastic. We didn't have that.
I could have got my nails done at one point. Any chance
Don't rule it out, by the way. You could have. I actually think if anything, when you've got taxpayers' money, there is that certain wastage, which I think has left them wide open to criticism. I mean, I could rhyme off Match of the Day pundits who were picked up in limousines and taken to football matches all across England. Money that was spent.
Well, let's start with the salaries.
Salaries.
Gary Lineker, I think, is a very natural broadcaster and is very, very good at what he does. But are we seriously saying that the viewing figures for Match of the Day will change if you say, I come in and I say, we're cutting your money in half. Right, I'm away. Fine, nice knowing you. We'll just bring somebody else on. Because you're right, the point that you make. The BBC trying to justify salaries on the basis of that as the market rate. They shouldn't be in the business of a market rate because they spend public money.
Yeah.
Other companies spend commercial money, and that's fine. That's a negotiation between the artist and the employer. What they spend on salaries, for many people, in my view, is completely unacceptable.
Broadcasting and politics are mixing nicely into these 2 quick questions, because I've got a few things that I really want to ask you, and we've kind of gone brilliantly scattergun across so many different topics there. But with regards to the politics, you've mentioned there about the changing face of it, and obviously you touched on the way we covered as a nation, whether it be the written press, who I thought were scandalous at times, the referendum. Now, depending on where you sit on it, I know there are people who are pro the union, there are people who wanted that independence, and I think the SNP made a real battle of it, coming from, I think, maybe around about 22% to suddenly get to 46, 48 with the Yes campaign. Do you think in your lifetime, or indeed in the next, 3-4 decades, there will be independence?
I think there'll be another referendum. Whether there'll be
not according to Wes Streeting.
Well, yeah, but I mean that's the here and the now and all the rest of it. I mean in my lifetime, again going back to my first political memory was Wilson winning in 74, and I never discussed politics with my mother and father, and I've never had a single conversation about politics. But we lived in an area which was a manufacturing area where there was still steelworks, where there had been coal mines, and you almost didn't need to ask them, because if you lived in an area of community with solidarity, you basically knew that the Tory man was for the posh people and Harold Wilson was basically on our side.
Yeah. In this area, my mum says, you never tell anybody who you're voting for, but the whole area was all Labour.
Yes.
You didn't need to ask. Right?
You didn't need to ask. I mean, but even at the 74 election, because that was the big breakthrough for the SNP. The SNP polled a third of the vote in 1974 in Scotland. They collapsed in 79. They went into the doldrums in the 80s. But there's the old order in Scotland. Scotland used to be dour, austere, on a Sunday, finger waving from men, because it was mainly men, in black attire, whether they were priests or ministers.
Telling you you're a sinner.
And you're a sinner, and it was socially conservative, and it was in actual fact quite a conservative society. Where we are now, from what we were when we were growing up, when we were at primary school starting at secondary school, it's a massively different country. It's a massively different country politically, and the building blocks of what you may well call unionism have changed. It means less to people. People now look at constitutional politics in a much more broader way. And the advent of the Parliament, people didn't really understand that the advent of the Parliament in 1999 in British political terms was a revolution, because the entire British state was about centralising, and a constitution that was unwritten, and everything being run through the Crown and Parliament, which is the basis of constitutional lawmaking, not only at Westminster, but at the Scottish Parliament as well. And things have changed. And the old certainties that were around when you and I were young are no longer the certainties. And people look at things in a different way. And once the constitutional genie was out the bottle, there was going to be a debate about, are the powers of this Parliament sufficient to do the job that we want it to do? So the constitutional debate hasn't gone away. The difference now, and the polls basically still say it's a split nation. But the fact that it's still a split nation 12 years on from the independence referendum, when, as you point out, going into the referendum in 2014, if you go back to the polls in sort of 2012, support for independence was in the high 20s.
Yeah.
It ended up in the mid 40s. The issue is there a sense in which it just is a natural progression? There'll come a point when the Supreme Court has already stated the obvious constitutionally, that you can't have an independence referendum unless you have the agreement of the Westminster Parliament in a Section 30 order under the Scotland Act as devolved to Holyrood. But if there is a mood that Scotland wishes to be independent, no Parliament can stand in the way of that if that is the demonstrable mood. In my view, what needs to happen now, and if one looks at the analogy with Northern Ireland, there's a formula for triggering a border poll.
Yeah.
Rather than have all these debates about, we have a mandate for this, we want another referendum, you should change the Scotland Act to write in a trigger mechanism where if you get to a certain level of support, it happens automatically.
In a strange sort of way, Brexit, which has divided Northern Ireland, might actually work constitutionally for Scotland.
I have always taken the view, and I remember having because I used to go to do 2 programmes in Brussels and Strasbourg every year, and Winnie Ewing's great boozing buddy was John Hume. And John Hume was a very thoughtful kind of Irish nationalist, very thoughtful. And I'd said to him that once one bit of the union goes, I think the domino effect will happen. I said, if Scotland votes for independence, Conservatives at Westminster really won't bother at all about the constitutional status in Northern Ireland. They really won't. But I've also taken the view, and we now see this through the election of a plaid government in Wales, if any other part of the union goes, I think the mindset of Westminster politicians will change overnight.
Strangely enough, and I just, one little point I've spoken to on this type of programme, Straight Talk, to politicians, and I've mentioned to them, sometimes to take people to what they think is the promised land, you need a charismatic figure. Tony Blair swept into power with pop stars and everybody thinking this is a brave new dawn, and he's always remembered for the Iraq War, but there was a tremendous amount of good that I thought as a politician Tony Blair achieved. You need a charismatic figure. Alex Salmond was very much a brilliant orator, someone who could actually put the message across, and people were on his bandwagon. Nicola Sturgeon, in a differing way, suddenly had a platform in COVID where people were thinking, this woman is the light, the way and the truth to get, the SNP.
There's almost a prayer in there.
Well, absolutely. People were looking and thinking, she's the person to do it. I've said to a couple of SNP politicians, you're not going to, no disrespect to him, I think he's a lovely man. I think he's got a lot about him, but I don't see John Swinney as the man to lead them to that promised land. I think he's more an administrator, more someone who is super efficient as a politician, but not as somebody who's charismatically going to take you across that bridge.
Well, you started off, the first politician that you mentioned was Tony Benn. If Tony Benn was leading the Scottish independence movement, and Tony Benn would have been I think against Scottish independence, because he comes from an old left-wing perspective, which is that you do not divide the working classes on the basis of flags and borders. But if you had someone of the ability of Benn, then, or indeed in a different kind of a way, although you won't be surprised to know I don't share his politics. Farage is very charismatic.
Yes.
And the ability to communicate messages is a big thing. If Scotland becomes independent, it will not happen when John Swinney is First Minister, but it will take somebody more charismatic than...
Flynn?
I doubt it, but it will take somebody with a big personality who can ride with the punches. It takes an ability to communicate. It also takes a very keen intellectual brain to roll with the punches.
Just on that point, you mentioned Nigel Farage there. We used to have a thing at Wishaw Market where a guy would stand up there with he'd talk at 100 miles an hour and he'd say, listen, in this box, fiver, you'll never believe it. It's absolutely magnificent. This is the bargain of the century. I mean, this thing will change your domestic life, right? And at Wishaw Market, people, they'd have a plant in there and go, I'll take one at a fiver, and this guy, to me, is a con man.
Well, I was always one for the barras, and my favourite line is, they're the lucky knickers at 3 pence for a pound. They're all the way for America. One yank in the raff.
There's a catchphrase I never thought I'd hear on this programme. But he's like that.
Yes.
I think he's dangerous. I think he's divisive. I think the message is, for me, takes us down a road to let some people that you would not speak to in the middle of Buchanan Street, who are sectarian, who are bigoted, who are, demonising people. And I think that is a dangerous road we're going down.
And I've always said, because look at they've gone from nothing to the joint second party in the Scottish Parliament. Reform, even in Scotland, are a phenomenon, absolute phenomenon. And we knew that the result that they got was more or less coming from all these local government by-election results where they were from a standing start getting 25-30% of the vote. I put it like this. I could stop 100 people in Sauchiehall Street on a vox pop and say, have you heard of the name Nigel Farage? And they would say, yeah. Have you heard of Reform? Yeah. Do you agree with what Nigel Farage says on immigration? And I bet a lot of people will say, we absolutely agree with Nigel Farage on immigration. And if I say, did you like Margaret Thatcher? They would say, absolutely not. And then if I said, do you know that in terms of economic policy, in terms of deregulating markets, in terms of labour law issues, which would go long way beyond the Tebbit law issues, privatisation. Do you know that he's to the right of Margaret Thatcher? And they wouldn't know that. And the part of the success of Reform is that they've kept it on the issue, which invites an over-emoting about issues, which is around immigration. And by the way, a lot of these issues are specifically south of the border. If you look at all of the predictions about the Scottish population, we don't need less, we need more, and we need skilled labour.
Yeah.
One of the issues that the independence movement would face was that it would need, and this is probably where the Irish model is quite instructive, they need more. But, the problem is that there's a lot more meets the eye to Reform than simply the issues on immigration.
Bernard, I've got two topics I want to quickly talk to you about before I then give you my classic quick-fire 5 or 6 questions that you've got to answer as if you were, naming, I know that, naming your favourite player. I know you'll duck and dive with them anyway, but I'll have a go at you for them. Before I get to Martin O'Neill and Celtic, which I know is close to your heart, let me just quickly talk about Donald Trump. Now, I might be wide of the mark here. I'm not going to the World Cup, so I don't need to worry about the USB stick in my phone to see what I've said about him in the last 5 years. But American politics and his second term in office has scared me because I think he's possibly one of the most dangerous people in the world. in a country which I love, and I've got lots of cousins who live there, and I had the chance to stay there for a long time myself. But I am utterly bewildered by his second term and the things that he does on a daily basis. And you know, you only have to look at what's happening with the World Cup, the visas, people struggling to get into their country, the rip-offs that are happening. But I look at him and I said to my wife, once they get to the midterm elections, they'll get him, because the Congress and state, the Senate will change, the axis will change, and they'll get a chance to maybe haul him to court for his misdemeanours. Do you think that will happen?
I've no idea. I mean, one of the problems about the American system of government and the Constitution, now we've got a Supreme Court in the UK, and the Supreme Court is a separate court.
Yeah, but it's not stacked full of what you would call, I can load it full of Republicans.
Well, you see, this is herein lies the issue. Everything from the special prosecutor system right the way through to the Supreme Court. The American Constitution supposedly works on the separation of powers. The president is the executive arm of government, Congress makes the laws, and the Supreme Court are the arbiters, in a sense, of what is constitutional and what is not, and what the extent of executive powers are. But they're not separate, because they're just all packed by the president in order to find clever legal minds, in order to come up with a way which justifies the unjustifiable. And it appalls me that there's no serious debate in the United States about whether or not their constitution is fit for purpose and whether there is separation of powers. The man governs in a way that, you know, a doctor could probably give you a diagnosis about this kind of behaviour. But of course, we should never lose sight of the fact, again, that he is elected. And I remember being on holiday. I was in Venice, in an Irish bar, funnily enough, in Venice, with two Americans who were great company. He was from New Jersey, she was from Queens, and she'd one of these accents that said Queens all along. And they were tremendous company, and they kept trying to raise the subject of politics, and I just wasn't going. They didn't know what I did or what my background was. I just didn't want to go there. And I thought, they're clearly so anti-Trump, they need to get it off their chest. And of course, when they did eventually get it off their chest, they weren't. They were pro-Trump. And I thought, how can, I mean, these were intelligent people. These were intelligent, lucid people.
Was it based on the finances and the fact that they didn't get taxed?
It was, well, there was a lot of that. There was a sense. And of course, a lot of this in America is undertones of race. But they just felt that the system wasn't working for them. And I said, but he's a deplorable human being.
Yes.
I said, now, we've been drinking together for 2 days. I love your company, and you've told me about your 21-year-old daughter and your 19-year-old daughter. Would you leave either of your daughters in the same room as Donald Trump? They never discussed politics after that again.
Yeah, that sums it up perfectly. Okay, I don't think have you ever been in a programme where we suddenly go, Donald Trump, from that end to a man who's thoroughly enjoyable and likeable. I've been in his company, I've fought with him, I've argued with him, but I hold him in such high regard, which is Martin O'Neill. Right choice or just kicking it down the road as a Celtic manager?
Well, he'd earned the right to decide whether or not he wanted it. But all of the issues around Martin's age, the individual that had raised these issues were Martin himself. He was in the vanguard of doing that. He's earned the right, and I always sort of, as a supporter, say, if there's a manager in place, you get behind the manager and you support the team. Everybody knows, though, of course, that what drives the concern with the supporters, the inability to make it in Europe. From that point of view, we need a change in terms of the financial model at the club. We need better communication at the club, and we probably need a manager who is a 2 to 5 year project over several transfer windows that can take you forward. clearly Martin in that sense is not your 2 to 5 year project.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the key thing is to keep us ahead. And at the end of the day, all managers will live or die by their signings. And there's a complete rebuild needed at Celtic.
And, you know, sometimes people will say, well, be careful what you wish for. They were a well-oiled machine as a business. You know, they're certainly one of the best-run clubs in Britain. But let me play devil's advocate with you. Should they be calling for the head of Dermot Desmond? He's a billionaire who can finance, and certainly he could finance Martin to a degree this summer that could silence a lot of the criticism. Should they be calling for a change at that level? Or should they say, listen, let's just have do you think the Celtic fans are saying, what we really want is a new board with a fresh approach, which is in line with the manager for the European ambition, but also changes this ethos, you know, at the moment, which many people perceive as toxic and distant and not really what Celtic's all about?
Well, a new board of directors with the largest minority shareholder still there isn't a new board of directors unless there is fundamentally a change on how the club is run. Now, on the sort of issue of all this kind of stuff, I mean, I did a little talk at Glasgow University, which was sort of leaked online, in which I said you would have to be just the most unreasonable individual and the most unreasonable supporter if you simply didn't accept that the utter dominance that the club has had over a near sort of quarter of a century has been delivered on the basis of the club being well run. Because if you don't get it right off the park, people aren't right, you're going to make bad decisions which will filter through on the park. So it is only right and proper to say we have been well run, and to say that a lot of the people who have been driving the management of the club deserve a lot of credit. The issue on the debit side of the ledger, which the supporters are concerned about, is an inability to make any meaningful progress in Europe, which they believe, and which I believe, is because they haven't spent properly. They need to get the communication better. And, you know, the only things what we've heard from the Desmond family in recent times is that incendiary statement on the night that Brendan Rodgers resigned, which may well all be true. I don't know. The only two people that know whether or not it's true are Brendan Rodgers and Dermot Desmond. They're the only two people who know whether or not this is true. It may well be true, but it has no credibility because there is no communication with the support. I don't know what Dermot Desmond's vision for the club is because he doesn't say anything. And then he sends his plenipotentiary to the AGM to read the Riot Act. Distant voices from a land beyond the waves in order to read the Riot Act. Well, that won't do if you don't communicate. You first of all have to establish your credibility with the people who are paying their money. They deserve that. They deserve that degree of respect. So I will wait and see what happens. The last season has been, if we take out the magic of the last couple of weeks, it was in part horrible, and one of the reasons why it was horrible is that I've never known in all of my years as a Celtic supporter, and I've been going to see Celtic for over 50 years, supporters actually falling out with one another and a toxic atmosphere. That's not what I was reared in. It's not what I was brought up in, and a complete disconnect between the mainstream and the board. You can only change that if you yourself are prepared to change and engage. I hope he does, because if he doesn't, the chances are we will be back here again.
Do you think he needs to show a modicum of humility and then a slight shift in the way he goes about it? Is that what needs to happen here?
Yeah, it would help if he simply came out and spoke to the supporters. I always say, I don't know what he's like. I don't know what he's like. I don't know what his vision is. I don't know where he sees Celtic being in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. I don't know whether he thinks, the current stadium is fit for purpose. Supporters will tell you the bit that needs done. What is the vision? From that point of view, Mr. Desmond appears blind.
Okay, here's the quick fire to finish. By the way, I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I never actually thought we were going to start off with. I didn't even have in the strategy. We'll start off with. By the way, they all went for a bevy and claimed expenses, but we went there. You took me off in a mazy, and I thought I'll start with them on this quick fire, and that'll relax them. But you relaxed them right away, Bernard. It was brilliant. Okay, best politician you've dealt with.
I can't answer that because I've dealt with a lot that were easy to deal with. I'll just say this, the more senior they are, First Ministers, Prime Ministers, they're easier to deal with. The worst people to deal with are councillors.
Right, okay, so the politician you most admired?
Harold Wilson.
Yeah? What was that about him?
He established the Open University in the full teeth of opposition from the university establishment, and I had more chats with Alex Salmond about Harold Wilson than any other politician, and Alex Salmond was a big Harold Wilson fan.
And that might actually just link into the question I was about to ask you, which is there one person that you'd love to have interviewed, and what question would you have asked them?
A person that I had no time for, Enoch Powell, and I would have asked him, was it something in your childhood?
Yeah, I'm sure he'd be able to nail that as well. Now, I had Ian Blackford in here, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. He's a big hippie.
He is a big hippie, yes, I know Ian, yes.
And I thoroughly enjoyed his company, but I did obviously start to ask him about the best political speech, good or bad, that you witnessed or watched. And I shared with them my favourite, which I'll share with you. My favourite was Geoffrey Howe, when he absolutely savaged Margaret Thatcher, the then Prime Minister. It was one of those jaw-dropping moments when he just absolutely lacerated her. And I thought, that is up there for me. There are several that that I can remember down through the years, but that one was there. Is there one for you?
Well, there's numbers of which I've watched, and I'm not saying I agree with these speeches, but which I thought showed a certain degree of courage. Hugh Gaitskell's speech in the early 60s against unilateral disarmament, Neil Kinnock's in Bournemouth in 85 against the militant tendency. But my favourite parliamentary put down was during a debate on abortion, I think the Alton Amendment, and Norman St. John Stevens, who was camp, gay, lofty, conservative, Catholic, was interrupted by the Labour MP for Werley East, Andrew Faulds. Remember, we were talking about abortion, and Faulds said, "We shall take," he was a great Shakespearean actor, was Andrew Faulds, "we shall take no lessons from a man incapable of putting a bun in anyone's oven."
Yeah. And you wouldn't get away with that line now, Bernard.
Well, you might.
Yeah. Is there one thing that you still have on your bucket list? Because you've achieved a lot. There are some who respect you. And of course, in this day,
Celtic winning a cup in Europe. That's the only thing I want to see. That's the only thing I want to see.
Talk about alienating the audience in Scotland. Yeah.
Well, I was in Seville, and Jim Kerr was a couple of seats along, and I just said I'd give every penny that I've got just to win. And he said, "Yeah, I know." And I said, "You've got a few more pennies than I have." Yeah. But that was, even although it was a defeat, in a peculiar kind of a way, I was sanguine about it, because I was there for 3 days, and it was a marvellous experience.
Yeah, I called it the school reunion. You met everybody that you went to school with, who seemed to be there. It was an absolutely
Remember, there was a woman from Coatbridge. She was wearing a granny with the 2 grandchildren either side, and she said, "I'll be paying for this for years, but I just want them to be here." Gets back to Fergus McCann's line, "I can't let these people down."
Yeah.
You listening, Mr. Desmond?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very good point. And the last point to finish, does Bernard Ponsonby have a hero?
No. well, in footballing terms, Danny McGrain.
Yeah?
Yeah. Danny McGrain.
I used to introduce Danny by saying I thought all right backs beat 5 people and then crossed it for Dalglish to score. And that's a perfect way to finish.
And when I retired from STV, I got this card that came in, and it was from Danny McGrain. And I'd got an email from his wife, Lorraine. And I remember from reading the papers years ago that she wasn't Lorraine but Lorraine.
Yeah.
And send me your address. And the card came in from Daniel Fergus McGrain, because I was the Celtic boy in 1975 and he was my favourite player. So when it comes to Celtic, he's my man.
Bernard, we've covered it all, by the way. We've done politics, past, present, we've done American politics, everything I had no sheets of paper.
Next week, sex.
Yes, absolutely. That's the 12:30 midnight programme with Ruffy. So I'm glad I'm not on it.
I did see the one with Bertie Auld. What was your best away game?
Honestly, it was absolutely magnificent.
And no greater Celtic supporter than Bertie Auld.
Yeah, doesn't get any better. A man who would stand up in a what do you call it, a box at Celtic Park and sing the Celtic song. He was absolutely priceless, Bertie. That interview was amazing that day as well. Yeah, you picked a great one there. Bernard, I've thoroughly enjoyed it. It was absolutely magnificent. If I had another hour with you, it'd be absolutely sensational. Good luck with your Ponsonby and Massey. It's absolutely fantastic, well received. And hopefully we'll get back on this couch sooner rather than later. Thanks for coming in.
Hail, hail.
Brilliant. Thank you. That should get us a lot of trouble. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening.